Today, we're going to examine 3 unsolved cases that will continue to haunt you. But first, welcome to True Crime with Maneater. If you're interested in all things true crime, including missing person cases, cold cases, and just the strange happenings of the world, you've come to the right place. Be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. Let's get started. On January 2nd, 1935, a young man who identified himself as Roland T. Owen checked into the Hotel President in Kansas. Employees would describe the man as well-dressed, maybe in his 20s or 30s, and didn't have any luggage with him. In fact, all he had was a comb, a toothbrush, and toothpaste. The bellboy would show Owen to room 1046. Later that afternoon, Mary was doing her housekeeping rounds. She entered into room 1046 and noted that it was dimly lit, but Owen was still inside. Before she finished cleaning, Owen would ask her to leave the door unlocked when she left because he was expecting company. He then left the room. She would later say that Owen appeared to be frightened, but she saw him again the following day when she cleaned his room. As Mary was cleaning, she heard Owen talking to somebody who he called Don. He would tell this person over the phone that he didn't want to have breakfast and that he already ate, and that he wasn't hungry. And then on the afternoon of January 3rd, Mary, the housekeeper, went to room 1046 and knocked on the door. She had fresh towels for the room. After knocking, as she waited for the door to be open, a man who she didn't know, and it didn't sound like Owen, asked what she wanted. She could hear 2 male voices in the room. She told the man that she was there to deliver towels, but the man said they don't need any towels. Mary found this really strange because she knew the room didn't have any towels, but she went about her rounds delivering the towels to the other guests. And then on January 4th, the hotel president's switchboard operator noticed the light for room 1046 was turned on, and that meant that the phone was off the hook. She of course asked the bellboy to go check it out. When the bellboy arrived at the door, there was a do not disturb sign on the door. And although he wanted to respect the wishes of the guest, he knocked. The voice from inside told him to come in, but the door was locked and he couldn't get in. So after waiting a few moments and realizing that nobody was going to unlock the door, he told the occupant through the door to hang up the phone. And then an hour later at 8:30 a.m., the phone had still been off the hook. This time, a different bellboy was sent to room 1046. He used his key to get in the room, and when he opened the door, he found Owen laying on the bed in the dark, completely naked. He assumed that maybe Owen had just been drunk, so he went over, hung up the phone, and left the room. And then again at 10:30 a.m., the phone was off the hook. So the bellboy went upstairs, used his key to gain entry, and what he discovered would haunt him for the rest of his life. The bellboy in a police report would describe the scene as something straight from a horror film. When he entered the room, the occupant was on his knees and elbows while holding his head. The bellboy turned on the light, and he would see blood smeared everywhere. It was on the walls, on the bed, in the bathroom. It was on the occupant's head. Owen was still alive, so the bellboy called for help. When investigators arrived, they asked the occupant, Owen, what had happened and who had done this to him. Strangely, Owen would say nobody did this to him and that he fell against the bathtub. He was brought to the hospital, and on January 5th, he died from his injuries. So of course somebody could have fallen and hit their head and had blood all over, but this case, it's even more horrifying. Owen had been found with his neck, ankles, and wrists tied. He had a fracture to his skull, but he also had multiple stab wounds to the chest, one of which punctured a lung. And the bruises on his neck suggested that he had been strangled. And the doctor doing the autopsy exam concluded that these injuries had happened 6 to 7 hours before his death. And since Owen claimed that nobody had been in the room with him, investigators ruled his death as a suicide, but no weapons were ever found in his room. And interestingly enough, fingerprints belonging to a female were found in Owen's hotel room. A couple months after Owen's death, the case went cold, and that's because he was using a fake name. He was going to be buried in an unmarked grave, but the funeral home taking care of his case got a strange call from somebody. They requested that the man not be buried right away and that they would pay for the funeral service. A few weeks later, the funeral home did receive the funds to cover the funeral, alongside a note that read, "Love forever, Louise." And then in 1936, a woman found a picture of the unidentified man in the paper. She took it to her friend Ruby. And that unidentified man, known as Owen in the newspaper, actually turned out to be Ruby's 17-year-old son, Artemis. On the left side of his head, he had a scar, and he had cauliflower ear, which made him easily identifiable. It was unmistakable. It was her son. And Ruby started to kind of put the crime together. In 1935, after her son's death, she had been receiving typewritten letters about her son's travels. She found it strange because her son didn't know how to use a typewriter, and she said that the writing and the words didn't sound like her son. These letters would come from places like Chicago and New York and Europe and really just all over the place. And in August of 1935, Ruby would receive a strange phone call saying that her son had saved somebody in Egypt and then married a wealthy woman. Don, the man on the phone, was never identified. Louise, who paid for the funeral, was also never identified. The fingerprints that were found in the hotel room belonging to some mysterious woman were also never identified. And the fact that when the housekeeper was there, she heard two unfamiliar voices that sounded like men in the room, they were never identified either. Obviously, there's a lot of theories about this case, from this boy being into organized crime to a jilted lover coming to kill him. Really, there's so many theories, but none of these theories have led to a solved case. I think what's really important to note is the phone was off the hook 3 times. Was this the boy knocking it off to get somebody to help him? Was the killer in the room with him at that time? The room had been dark every single time an employee went in there. I think someone could have easily hid in the bathroom when an employee let themselves into the room. Kyron Horman was a 7-year-old boy who loved forensic science. He would spend some of his time living with his mom, and other days he would be with his dad and his stepmom. Although the 7-year-old's family had gone through kind of a rough divorce, he was still able to see his mom and his dad. His father remarried and had another child with Terry Moulton, who was now Kyron's stepmother. Shortly after 8 a.m. on Friday, June 4th, 2010, the 7-year-old arrived at Portland's Skyline Elementary School. It was the day of the science fair, and Kyron was so excited. With the help of his stepmother, Terry, Kyron went into school and set up his science fair project. He was even wearing his CSI shirt. Terry was the last person to ever see Kyron alive. She reportedly watched him walk down the hallway to his classroom and then headed out for the day. She would report that after she left the school, she went to the grocery store. However, it was reported that she was actually at 2 grocery stores until approximately 10:10 a.m. Between then and 11:39 a.m., Terry had no alibi. She did claim she was driving on some rural roads to soothe her infant daughter, Kiara, who had an ear infection. She would then check into a 24-hour fitness center at around 11:39 a.m. She stayed there for approximately an hour. She would later claim at around 1:21 p.m. that she arrived home. She would log into Facebook and post photos of Kyron from that morning. When Kyron's father, Kane, arrived home to meet the school bus at around 3:30 p.m., he was horrified when his son never arrived. So Kane and Terry jumped in the car and drove to the elementary school. They were horrified when they learned that Kyron had been marked absent all day. They had the secretary at the school dial 911, and this sparked one of the largest missing person searches in Oregon history. It's important to understand the family dynamics to really get the gist of this case. Obviously, Kyron's parents had split up when he was super young, but they did share custody. That is, until his mother became seriously ill with kidney problems. She was so ill, in fact, that she had to move back in with her parents and give full custody to Kyron's father, Kane, until she fully recovered. Kane eventually married Terry, and they had their daughter, Kiara, but things weren't as they appeared. The relationship was rocky, and they were having marital issues. What investigators would unearth was incredibly startling. In the emails and messages sent to her friends, Terry would blame Kyron for all of her marital issues. She expressed in great detail how much she hated the little boy. And during Terry's first polygraph exam, there was indication of deception. Desiree Young, Kyron's biological mother, said she had no doubt that Terry was capable of hurting Kyron, especially after seeing those messages Terry had sent to her friends. And then a bombshell would blow this case open. In July of 2010, a local landscaper that Terry had hired showed up at the police station. He told police that 6 months prior to the boy's disappearance, Terry had offered him money to kill her husband. Of course, the detectives called Kane, and he immediately took his 19-month-old daughter and left the house. He would file for a restraining order and then divorce Terry. And although there's a lot of suspicion clouding Terry, no arrests have been made. And in fact, Kyron has never been found. There's no forensic evidence linking her to the crime. There's no witnesses. There's just a lingering suspicion that she took the boy and murdered him. Our next case defines unsettling in the most horrific way. 70 kilometers or 43 miles north of Munich, Germany, Andreas Gruber had noticed some strange things happening on his farm. About a week prior to March 31st, 1922. He found footsteps leading from the woods towards the house, but none ever leading away from it. But he didn't report the footprints to police because he lived in a safe and relatively quiet place. And then on March 31st, 1922, the quiet, safe place the Gruber family had once known turned into a place of sheer terror. It's unknown if one person or multiple persons committed this crime. Each of the Gruber family members were lured into the barn and to their death. Andreas, his wife Kazilla, their adult daughter Victoria, who was a widow, her children, Kazilla and Joseph, and the new family maid Maria, were all murdered. Almost a week later, on April 4th, neighbors and several townspeople stopped by to check on the family. Young Kazilla hadn't gone to school for 2 days in a row now, so of course they were concerned. And the mailman had noticed that the mail had also been piling up for the last week. So they immediately called the police, who began their investigation. When police stumbled in on the grisly scene, they were horrified. And although they tried really hard to solve this case, it has never been solved. And through the years, they've interviewed more than 100 people, all the way up until 1986. And to this day, the murders remain unsolved. Police believe that each member of the family was beaten to death with a pickaxe, and they all died relatively quickly due to their injuries, except young Kazilla, who had survived for hours after the attack. She had even been missing patches of hair, and investigators believe that she had been pulling them out herself. They believe that she died later due to shock. A few days before the murder, not only had Andreas noticed the footprints, neighbors would recall that Andreas had been complaining about hearing footsteps in the attic. There were missing keys to the tool shed, which is where the murder weapon had actually been stored. Andreas also told his neighbors he found a newspaper in his home that he hadn't purchased. The maid, before Maria, quit 6 months prior to the murder because she believed the house was haunted. She would hear the footsteps. She knew things were going missing, and unfortunately, it was Maria's first day of work on the day that she was murdered. And police came to the conclusion the suspect had been living in the Gruber's attic for more than 6 months before the murder. Eventually, the family was buried, and their farmstead was destroyed. And although police are still looking into this, the investigation is kept quiet, out of respect for the still living descendants of the family. And that's it. Thank you guys so much for joining me. If you like this video or any other video on my channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. See you next time.